Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. In this episode, we speak to Miles Daffin about Represen API Studio. Miles is a product manager at Represen API Studio and has been working in IT since 1999 after taking his Masters in Software Engineering at Bristol University, where he discovered his love for programming. He's held a range of diverse jobs, from Somerset dairy farming through to caring for the brain-injured adults and emotionally disturbed children, through to computer programming and investment banking. This various background enables Miles to understand and communicate with people from all walks of life. He's a firm believer that specialisation is for insects, and that what makes us truly human is the ability to do lots of different things. So welcome to the Cynical Developer, and firstly, thank you for reaching out and getting in touch about Represen.
Yeah, pleasure, James. And you don't sound very cynical to me. Why do you have that name then?
Well, I try to come across quite friendly to start with, and it's the other side of me that comes out. I think, well, why should I even do this? What do I need another tool for to do something I'm already doing?
Oh, and, I like that. I did see that. Yeah, why should I care? Why should I be interested in this? Because people are just bombarded with stuff these days, aren't they?
Oh, definitely. And there's a new JavaScript framework or a new DLL that comes out every week to do everything that we've been doing for years.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so basically, this is in that context. What makes all this stand out from the rest? What would make it interesting? Why would I even be talking to you about it or involved with it?
Yeah, definitely. Just to give the listener an overview of Represen and say, well, why should they use it? And it's a bit of a quick introduction so that they don't have to go and read all of the documentation and everything to work out if it is or isn't for them. So it's a bit of a high-level overview for them.
Great. Okay. Good stuff. Okay. Yeah. So where should we begin then, James? How would you like to start this?
Yeah, we'll kick it off with what is Represen. Let's go from that nice easy one.
Right. Thank you. Okay. Well, Represen really is a company, and the company's our primary focus is we're a product company, and our flagship product is API Studio, and in short, so some of our customers are pure product subscribers and they just want the software and they're happy to go away and look after themselves. And some of our customers need a bit more strategic consulting and custom integration and so on, so that they can make the most of the product that we've sold them. So we don't just kind of throw the product over the wall and run unless that's what you want. Right. We're really here with the company's made up of a diverse range of people with an enormous amount of experience in the area of APIs and data and software engineering and the enterprise environment. And we are keen to make sure that people are successful. That's really our mission, is to make sure that people are successful with the stuff that we're selling.
Right. Okay. So is API Studio a SaaS service, or is it something that you download and install? What is API Studio?
Well, so so it's a thing that you download and install, and when I explain it to people when they ask me what I'm doing at the moment, I say it's an IDE, it's a tool for designing and refining and developing web-based APIs, RESTful APIs primarily at the moment, although we are kind of diversifying in the longer term. And so, as we know, like the sort of the next big thing on the internet, or the current wave of big thing on the internet, is the idea of web-based APIs as a way of connecting everything to everything else. So the communication endpoints, we see APIs are almost like the neural connections of the next generation of internet connectivity, and we make tools, or a tool, primarily one tool, for helping you define, describe, and develop these in a very powerful way. And we'll go into more detail as we go along. But yeah, there's an emphasis on interoperability. So obviously, if we've got all these endpoints for communication, we want information to be able to flow between these endpoints. In order to be able to flow between the endpoints without an enormous amount of integration effort, we need these endpoints to be sort of speaking a common language.
Sure. So it's a bit like a standardization as well as an IDE between all that communication that's going over the wire.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got the idea of a product that's a great environment for authoring APIs. But that's not just the end of the story. It's really about making sure that these APIs are interoperable as well, so that they're easy to use in conjunction with one another. And and that's the way it goes. You might use one API on its own, but you're probably going to be using three or four maybe in conjunction with one another, especially as the number of APIs on the internet increases.
Sure, sure. I think every single day in my day job, I interact with tens, if not hundreds, of different APIs. So I know what that's like,
Yeah,
and making it nice and common would be a good thing.
yeah.
And I can see a lot of people or imagine a lot of people listening to this thinking, really, an ID just for working with APIs? What are the benefits of using API Studio over doing your API integration in another IDE, such as Visual Studio or NetBeans or whatever they do or they use on the dark side?
Well, I mean, okay, I don't at the moment. It's not so clear cut as that, So if we were talking about Java, for instance, we'd be, there would be the usual suspects. You'd be talking about IntelliJ and Eclipse versus various other different things like NetBeans,
Yep.
and what have you. And why would I choose this one over that one? Because they're very comparable. They're very feature-rich environments. They all chase one another. But because of the relative newness of this technology, what we actually see is that the Represen API Studio is a sort of full enterprise class IDE which is built on the Eclipse platform, and its primary focus is the development of APIs. And so if you look at the other, most of the other products that we end up competing with are not really IDEs at all. They're just specialized web-based editors, so they lack the power really that you've come to expect when you use an IDE in a company, in terms of its ability to integrate with and connect with your development environment, with the development infrastructure, like source control, continuous integration, the file system, the distributed file system, the intranet and the resources on that, and all those things that you take for granted as a developer in a classical IDE, in a classical development environment. So our competitors aren't really similar class of things. They're quite straightforward, quite simple things by comparison. And then I suppose the other aspect to it is that if you compared it with things like other IDEs like Visual Studio, well, these can be used in conjunction with API Studio for doing things like implementing services that are designed and defined in API Studio. If you want to implement your services in C# or .NET, then the generated outputs from API Studio serve as inputs to Visual Studio. So we're not really a competitor there. But if you're using Java, for instance, instead of .NET, you can stay inside API Studio for the entire development lifecycle, from design, generating, implementing stuff, and all the way through and back again in an iterative fashion. So does that help you understand where we are?
So API Studio, as the name says, it's specifically for building APIs. It's what it specializes in. Whereas the likes of Eclipse and Visual Studio, they're a toolbox for everything. So
yeah, indeed.
They're not as specialized, and I guess you're probably going to give better user experience, more powerful tools, things like that for actually building these APIs.
Yeah, so I mean, primarily around editors that support the definition of the APIs themselves using API description languages.
Right.
So API Studio supports a couple of API description or definition languages, Swagger Open API, and our own, which is now open source, and our own API description language, which is called RapidML, which is a slightly higher level language than Swagger, and it's more domain driven, it's data driven. So it's different, and we can talk about what those differences are a bit later.
Yeah, so Swagger and RapidML, you just mentioned there, they're languages for defining your API. Could you go into a little bit more about that? It's not something I'm really aware of.
Okay.
So I would imagine there's going to be people that are listening that don't know what they are as well.
Yeah, well, so an API description language is a high-level way of describing an API, normally in terms of resources and verbs. So nouns, stuff that's existing on the internet, of one sort and another, and then and then the verbs, which are the operations that you can do on that particular resource or collection of resources: create, update, delete, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we take both Swagger and RapidML enable you to describe resources and operations on those resources at a fairly high level, and you can add documentation. And really, it's from the point of view of understanding what are the endpoints for communication in the API, and what are the messages going to look like that will pass backwards and forwards, in terms of request and responses to and from the API. So Swagger, for instance, started out as a pure sort of documentation format, sort of post facto, where we've got all these APIs that we've slaved away creating in code, and they're all there running out there on the internet as services. Now, how do we describe them to people so that they actually know what's there and they know how to talk to it, right? So Swagger really was a way of documenting this, so people could understand what it was you had to offer, and what a well-formed request would look like, and what kind of response should you expect back, and all that kind of stuff. And so they were sort of an afterthought, if you like. And now what the kind of the way the workflow that we're seeking to promote, and that API Studio is really geared to facilitating, is what we call a contract first web workflow for API design and development, where instead of treating the API description as a sort of second class citizen, if you like, or an afterthought, it becomes the primary artifact. It becomes a first class part of your code base, almost like a programming language, like another programming language, like a declarative programming language almost. Yeah. So you go ahead and you say, well, so from the outside, I don't know how much programming experience you've got or our listeners have got, but my favorite language has always been, object oriented, but Java particularly, because I've been with it sort of since inception. And you define an interface. So when you define the interface, and you might even do that from the point of view of writing some tests that go against that interface before you've got any live code at all. And it just enables you to think from the outside in and think, look, what would this thing, if I had this thing and it did what I needed it to do, what would it look like from the outside? What operations would it have? What would it be like to interact with them? And then when I'm really clear that this thing is just totally fit for purpose from the point of view of the shape it has on the outside surface, then I can go ahead and start implementing it. So we've gone at web-based API, RESTful API design and development in much the same way. So where the definition of the API is this kind of primary artifact, and you work on that in API Studio, you can define an API within minutes. You can add example data to it so that you can then actually go against that API. You can run a mock service that will play the API as though it was a working service, and then you can make HTTP requests and get responses from it and see what it would feel like to interact with it, and try it, effectively test drive it, say, is it really doing what I want it to do? And once you've iterated over that a little bit, editing the code, the definition, giving it a go, editing the code, giving it another little go, maybe even showing it to potential API consumers, then you could go, right, I think we're ready to generate some code. So you would then generate a multitude of different things from that single source of truth, that primary artifact, in either RapidML or Swagger. And out the back of that generation process, you would get extra documentation, diagrams of the API. So we've got the sense of the topology of the API and how the different resources interact with one another. You would end up with a multitude of client libraries, so that for code needing to talk to your API, you give it a client library so it's ready to go in whatever language you want. And also stub code, service implementation code to get you started. So that you can go off and actually create a working service based on that definition. And then the idea of the contract first workflow means that you go around it iteratively. So you go, once you've done all that, and maybe you've got the first version of your working service and you've deployed it to production, and then you want an incremental new version of it that adds another resource or another operation on an existing resource. You go back to your definition written in Swagger or RapidML, sorry, Open API, I should say now, and you modify it there, and then you rerun your code generators, and then you go back to your working implementation. You fix the compilation errors, you fill in the gaps, you complete the implementation, and you're ready with a new version.
Sure. So the RapidML side of it, it's the contract's very similar, I guess, to what we used to do for SOAP services with WCF. You'd write your contract and then you'd go and you'd fill in the little bits in the background. But it's a little bit more than that, because you've got basically a templating engine over the top of it that you write your contract, and then that goes out and stubs out all the methods that you need, all your returns that should be there, and you've just got to fill the bits in, the logic in between.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, and that's true for both of the languages that we support. It's not just RapidML. Right. I mean, the difference between, I mean, what I'm giving you now is the sort of generic overview
sure.
of the sort of, the ethos of API Studio, which includes both of those languages. So the difference between, but yeah, you're right. Basically, you're going from a high level definition. And once once you're happy with that, you can then generate stuff. You generate your documentation, you generate client code, and you generate your server-side implementation stubs with the object model necessary to actually go backwards and forwards from the wire representation of the data to the object model and all that stuff with all the translation between. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that all the boilerplate code, all the really dreary coding that nobody wants to do, is done in the blink of an eye by our code generation framework. And you just then have to go on and like I say, fill in the actual kind of clever stuff, the guts of the implementation within the framework that's been spat out by the code generator. Yeah,
that's good. I think one of the points that I picked up on was the fact that you can stub it out and have it return that stub data pretty quickly, which would be very handy to have, rather than sort of writing your real implementation and then whipping that out and writing a duff implementation of some provider somewhere so that you can actually test it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a common pattern, right? I mean, there are other solutions around that also enable you to kind of mock things out. I mean, and things like Open API. Part of the language is the idea of an example. So if you're somewhere and you're defining a request or a response, you can add an example element, and you can say, and this is what it would look like.
Right.
This is what a well-formed request would look like in terms of its data, its payload, and this is what a well-formed request to that response would look like. So that you've got this thing that's documentation, but then we can take that documentation inside API Studio, and from point of view of the response data, you can then run that definition inside the the emulator, if you like, and when you hit that particular method on that particular resource, then the data that comes back is going to be that static data that you've defined as part of your documentation. So you're right, you don't need to actually start implementing until you've got things to a point where the behavior, the look, the feel of the API is as you'd want it to be, and then there's going to be less change, right? Less ridiculous,
sure.
Or annoying change, and that's true for both languages. You can do that.
Okay. You said that it produces documentation off the back of that. Does that produce it in a set format? Is it sort of markdown files, or Word, or PDF, or a website, or is it optional? Can it do any of them?
Yeah, it can do. I mean, the thing is that we've got, I think at the moment, last time I did a little video about all of this, and I think last time I counted the number of code generators that we currently have out of the box, it was over 70.
Right.
So, and we've got, and that's stuff that we've written ourselves, and that's stuff from other vendors, and it's also stuff from the big Swagger Open API code gen project on GitHub.
Right.
So there's an enormous range of things, again falling into those three categories of either I want additional documentation for my API in a different format, I want to see what it looks like in HTML or what have you, or client libraries so I can talk to this API from a variety of different programming languages, or I want stub implementation code in a variety of different languages, Java, .NET, you name it.
Yeah,
right?
that point is a massive bonus. Now, in one of my previous roles, I produced an API that was being used, and I had several conversations with a couple of different development departments in some very large, very well-known companies who wanted to know how they talked to our API because they'd never spoken to a REST API before and they didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And when I picked myself up off the floor, first from shock, then from laughing, was the case of, well, I've not done it in your programming language before, and I think one of the guys that said he didn't know how to do it, he asked me to write an example I hadn't written in that programming language for about 10 years. So I had to quickly cobble together something to say, look, this is how you go and use a REST API. But if this did it out of the box, it'd be fantastic because we could just whip it up onto a website and say, go and have a look at your the documentation here, and it would save face for me and for them as well.
Oh yeah, well totally. I mean, the thing is, like I said, the API definition or the description it is the primary artifact, and if you do a really good job of maintaining that and making sure that totally expresses what it is you're doing and how you want it to be, then you've only got to, and you can do all this in continuous integration as well, because the code gen framework is runnable from the command line.
Right.
So you can either be generating all of this stuff in the IDE as you go along in order to test it and use it, or you can, it can be part of your continuous integration process. And so from this one file, or maybe it might be multiple files, but let's just say one file, you get all of your client libraries in whatever languages you want, generated and regenerated every time you've made changes to your API. You get, you get a new version of the client libraries, which you can then give, and you can put all of that inside your developer portal for your APIs, so that somebody can come along, they can browse your APIs, what you've got, and if that sounds right, and they can go and look at it, they can see what the resources and methods are on the API. They can see, they can actually poke it in a sort of sandbox area where they can, do what we said, like the mock service, where they can see how it responds when you talk to it, these different operations for every single one. And then, they can download client libraries in the languages that you've decided to support, basically. And you'll get all of that out the back for free, basically.
Right. So if I'm going in and I'm making changes to my API and regenerating the documentation, how does it deal with versioning? Is it just a blanket, this is now the new version and that's it?
Well, the versioning question is an interesting one, right? And there are patterns, if you like, best practices and so on for doing this. But but there's nothing. API Studio doesn't mandate an approach to version control, to versioning your APIs.
Sure.
And like we've all worked in lots of different places. There are lots of different ways of doing release management, and API Studio can work with any of those, however you decide to do it, really. But yeah, I mean, just in the same way that if you wrote something in Java, the IDE wouldn't be telling you what to do in terms of versioning. You'd have to work that out yourself. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. So, what else can I tell you?
It is designed for generating these APIs, building these APIs up, and documenting them. Can you use it to document existing APIs that you've built with something else somewhere else?
Yeah, you can, and we've done big projects with some clients doing exactly that, where they've had an enormous catalog. Well, in fact, they haven't had a catalog actually. They've just had a great, like your description just now of when the client says, "Tell me what this thing is and does, so I know how to talk to it." Where you've got there's a whole bunch of stuff sitting there out in the wild, if you like, and they want some way of documenting it. And so that's exactly what we did with them, where we went in and we annotate. You can annotate existing APIs, and then you can generate Swagger specifications from those APIs, which you can then stick into your documentation portal. And we did some work on that to make sure that the code gen and everything that we did would work with that, and they could then in turn take those generated Swagger Open API descriptions of their APIs, and from that they could then get all these other artifacts that they wanted to go into their documentation portal.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I think that makes it quite powerful, the fact that if you're not using it at the moment, you can actually bring it in, and it's not a case of having to rewrite everything. You can just write the new stuff in it for now and actually retrofit it. So,
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, you've always got to work with the world as it is. I mean, like I say, our kind of predilection in terms of an approach is to do what this sort of contract first approach, where you start with your definition and you work and you go from the top of the circle round through code generation to implementation to deployment to up to the top again when you want to start work on your next version. But it doesn't, we're not stuck with that. But that's just the way we think. That's the most efficient way of going. And you're sort of, I don't know what research there is on this, but I mean, we're talking about a much better, much faster velocity in terms of developing your APIs if you work in that way. And you get a better output, because you've got all your documentation and everything else, and the whole lot will be in sync with what you're actually doing,
sure.
with the reality of it. So I suppose I think one of the things I don't know if I've made clear is about the real sort of difference between API Studio as opposed to some of the other things that are out there at the moment. You've got, and I think it's worth distinguishing. API Studio, for instance, from I guess sort of two things. One would be what we've already talked about, the web-based editors and so on for APIs that already exist out there. But you're also looking at things like API management platforms or API management systems. And a lot of people come to us and say, is it an API management system? And the answer to that is no, but it works with API management systems. So what if you don't know what an API management system, the short answer to what an API management system is it's a way of actually kind of managing and controlling and monetizing and monitoring and just dealing with a bunch of APIs that exist in the wild. So you kind of stick them behind a kind of a management facade. So all of the calls from the external users go through your facade, and that enables you to exert a degree of control in terms of security and rate limiting and monetization and whatnot. So our API Studio works very well with those, and a lot of those API management systems also provide a degree of sort of authoring tools. Some of them sort of even kind of indicate that you might be able to use them for the full life cycle, but it's not quite true because the level of support in terms for the design and development of the APIs is nowhere near what we're offering. I mean, I can't quote the company, but I was speaking to the developer marketer for one of the big API management platforms, and I showed him what we're doing, and I said at the end of the interview, well, at the end of the chat we were doing, I said, so do you think this is how do you think this compares with what you're offering in the design and development space for APIs? I mean, do you think this is more advanced than what you're offering or not? And he just laughed. And he said, yeah, definitely. In fact, we'd be quite interested in seeing if we can do partner with you in some way, because they could see that the amount of effort we've stuck into the product is something that would be very difficult to emulate, really, and they'd have no need to because it's not really what they're doing. So I think that, but I think the main point is that I guess the sort of story is that all the people in the company, we all came from an enterprise background, and we've all done written software and been making things for a long time in an enterprise setting, and anybody anyways, we're all used to tools of a certain quality, like a decent IDE that's going to do, syntax highlighting and it's going to validate on the fly, and it's going to have code assist, and it's going to have the ability to kind of, templates where you can write your own code assist, code expansion templates, and all these other powerful features, and the ability to navigate and search across multiple files in a directory tree, and also integration with your version control system of choice, so that files get checked in and out in the background as you like automatically, and integration with continuous integration and whatnot. So all of these features that we'd grown used to in order to support our development work over the years that were really missing when you looked at the design, definition, and development of APIs. And so we were keen to, to create tools that would be the tools that we would want in order to do this kind of work. So you've got that. So this API Studio is designed to really kind of designed and to integrate into an enterprise environment, and it's much easier to do that than with these purely web-based tools. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. I think when I had a quick look round at it, my real first sort of thoughts on it were, why would I do this? Why would I use this when I know that I can produce perfectly sound APIs in my other IDE? But you've made a good argument for why, and it does a lot of stuff that my day-to-day job IDE doesn't, which is pretty good as well.
Yeah. So,
does it come? And this is the big one. Does it come with a price tag?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it does. It does cost a little bit of money. I mean, we've got basically it's a subscription model, so it's easy to get into and it's easy to get off if that's what you want to do. We're not locking anybody in. And you can either go month to month or you can go annually, and I mean it's as simple as that, really. Okay. I mean we've tried to keep it, and also we're all. We've got monthly, we've got annual plans. We've got anybody can do a 15-day evaluation, which can be extended upon request. And we've also got stuff that's free if we're not really ready to spend money yet. So I mean, we've just released something called the Kaizen Open API editor, and also which comes with the Open API parser. And we believe this is the first editor that supports the new version of OpenAPI, OpenAPI 3, which is still in the process of being defined, but it's due for release and finalization later this year.
Sure.
And we've open sourced that, so that's out on GitHub, and you can install that straight into your IDE, into Eclipse from the Eclipse marketplace.
Right.
In fact.
So if you're an early adopter, then it's definitely something to get on and have a look at then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly if you're somebody that's interested in advancing the way in which APIs are described in what is becoming, in fact, probably now is, I think, the industry standard way of describing APIs in a human and machine readable way, which is OpenAPI. If you're interested in if you've got any axes to grind, or there's anything that you didn't like or wanted to see improved in Swagger Open API 2.0, you can take Kaizen, which will and write your Open API 3 specifications and explore the current specification where it's at, and come up with some suggestions which you can feed back into the community process.
Okay.
So really, it's really there so people can experiment and play with OpenAPI 3. So yeah, you've got everything, and you've got all of the features that you've got inside the editor when it's inside Represen API Studio. So you've got outline view, and you've got code templates, you've got multi-file content assist, outline navigation, all of these things that make, I used to feel that it was like when my first proper IDE, I felt like I had the code base in my hands. I was holding the whole damn thing, and I could rummage through it. I could kind of, I could swim through it from one side to the other. I could refactor across the entire thing. It had gone from being a bunch of files with text in to being a kind of a living thing, a malleable living thing, and that's really what we're talking about.
Sure. So that's fantastic. Now, all the things that we've talked about, I'll include in the show notes as well. We'll put the links in there to Represen and to the Open API and to was it Kaiser?
Kaizen, yeah, Kaizen, yeah. We've
Kaizen,
got Represen. Kaizen is it's kind of a nice play on words because it's like Represen, but it's a Japanese word for the process of continuous improvement.
Right. Okay. Well, there we go. If I want to learn some more about this, do you have documentation, courses, any videos or anything like that?
Yeah, Yeah, well, the simple answer to that is go to the website, go to represen.com, and go and look up, and also go and look at our YouTube channel, because we've done a bunch of videos that describe and explain different aspects of the product there. So you're going to learn about, and really again, you're going to learn out the support that we've got for Swagger Open API, and the support for RapidML, and also a bit more about what makes RapidML really stand out. I mean, that is part of the story, and maybe it's something that we could talk about briefly, actually, because I mean, actually, that's one of the, we've talked about one strand of the story, which is about our desire for real tools for doing this job, and for making the API specification like actually part of the code base, rather than just this kind of afterthought. We wanted to promote it to like a first class citizen in the code base, and like it was a real programming language. And we wanted tooling for doing that would be as good as what we'd grown to expect, because because of our backgrounds.
Yeah.
But the other side, and really, I mean, I guess the thing that really sold the company to me when the CEO Ted talked about it. I mean, Ted and I have known each other for quite a few years anyway, because we worked together in the city for quite a while. Is this, the challenge of APIs, the promise of APIs. Now, look, we all know in IT, in this game, that waves of things come along that promise so much. You're going to be able to integrate everything with everything else, and there've been a number of different attempts to provide a kind of platform or a way of getting everything, of putting Humpty together again, or maybe even putting Humpty together for the first time, right? So APIs are about this too. It's about, well, I mean, my kind of glib summary for API use in an enterprise would be, step one, get your act together internally, integrate, and then step two, having done that, you can then kind of get your show on the road, if you like. You can then start, you're then actually exposing APIs that you can enable you to make money by selling services to people on the internet, right? And that's obviously what's sustaining the whole thing. So how do we make the most of that promise of APIs? Because it's very, it's an amazing idea, being able to actually leverage HTTP to actually as the medium through which we're going to achieve this grand vision of integrating things. And so one of the things that's really going to get in the way of that happening is if all of these APIs are just developed in isolation and mutual ignorance of one another, every time a new one pops onto the scene, it's going to be a little bit different from all the other ones, maybe. Sure. It's just going to have a number of I mean, the primary thing that's going to be different is the data language it's speaking. You could have two APIs side by side, and they could both be talking about fruit, but they'd have a different way of describing the fruit. They'd have different properties, different names. How would you might even, if it got more technical and it was some internal part of the fruit, you wouldn't even necessarily know that two different concepts were even the same. They could have the same name but be different. They could have different names but be the same underlying concept. You've got what you call like a Babel of different languages. Do you know this sort of, and what you've got there is you've got this sort of divergence of things scattering off in different directions as everybody goes their own way. You've got chaos, you've got entropy, you've got enormous integration costs further down the line. So if people rush blindly into APIs like it's some sort of .com boom promise and everybody's going to get rich, then there's a high likelihood for things to get very expensive and to run aground or get bogged down as the inherent entropy in the situation begins to take its toll. So we looked at all that. So how are we going to mitigate against that threat? So we had and the CEO in particular has been working in this field for about 20 years and just having a very simple vision of what if all these different APIs, and it's not an idea that's unique to us, but I think that we have one of the strongest actual sort of implementations of this in RapidML. What if we could get all of these APIs to talk a common language? So irrespective of the language of the background system, it might be like, the equivalent of a conference, an international conference. We'd have Japanese people from all different countries in Africa, you name it, and they all want to talk together in an international conference. And what many of these conferences do now, the standard pattern is, rather than having an interpreter go from one language to every other language that's present at the conference, you have an interpreter for every single person that turns up who knows 2 languages, the host language, the home language, and English.
Yep.
So everything they say gets translated into English, into a pool of English, which then gets translated back into the host language of all the people present. So from an architectural point of view, it's a massive simplification, right?
Yeah. But
so what if
you could lose you would lose stuff in that simplification process as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're always going to lose stuff in translation, right? If you go from one system to another,
Yeah.
there's always going to be complications, but increase, but you're looking at a way of how do we get these sort of I mean, you might end up, where increasingly the APIs start to actually kind of be written in, implemented in using the common language, because it's just quicker. And why wouldn't you? Why would you go inventing all of your data concepts from scratch when you could reach into this kind of reusable pool of reusable data definitions that sits in the middle and actually define your back-end database in those terms so that you speed the whole thing up. So that's what RapidML is about. So when we define resources in RapidML, we define them based on a data type that comes from a canonical, technology neutral data definition that's written at a very high level.
Right.
And then that pot of reusable definitions is something that can then be shared across multiple API projects so that they all speak a kind of a common tongue, and the way in which that's defined can be emergent, as in, if people come along and they need a new concept adding, it can be added. So you don't need to define it all up front.
Yeah. So you're looking at the future for Represen is that you've got a good comprehensive IDE, but you're also flying the flag and marching everybody in the right direction to sort of come to one unified place of this is how we write RESTful APIs, rather than everybody doing their own thing and rolling it their own slightly different way.
Yeah. It is, but it's about how we go about achieving that. So rather than it being prescriptive, it's more like what you call system conditions, right? How can you put the kind of system conditions in place that encourage what you might call convergent rather than divergent behavior when it comes to these APIs and services? So do whatever you like and be as creative as you like, but it might actually be easy. How can we make it easier to work in a convergent way so that down the line you're going to find it easier to make your API, developer sitting on his own who just wants to get on and get something done is going to find it easier to work in this way than somebody just kind of having to do it all from scratch themselves. And the net result of that is going to be something that plays nicely in a broader family of APIs within a particular company. And, you can extend that across between companies as well, data as a sort of, a generalized, the possibility of using this technology to let common standards for talking about things emerge. Again, you're not shoving them on people, but you're providing an environment in which these things can be defined through a kind of community process, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that sort of standardization is really good. And I worked with an API from one of the UK's largest courier companies, not naming any names, and their API looked like it had been written by somebody on work experience who didn't really understand XML or had a grudge against it, and he or she or they had seemingly written their own type of XML that had its own weird and wonderful nuances, and it made it an absolute pain to work with. The things that should just work straight out of the box didn't work, and a lot of the times I would send them the requests that we were making that were returning no results, and they were saying, well, they should do, and we've passed it through to the IT department and they don't know what's wrong with it. And you just end up in an absolute rabbit warren of trouble, I think, if when you start rolling your own stuff like that. But definitely standardization gets us so far away from that and into a good place where we can actually concentrate on the important parts of the software rather than what it should look like.
Yeah, making that easier and helping people by helping people. You see, if your APIs have been written sort of from the code outwards, so from the implementation backwards, if you like, then how do you know what it looks like and feels like from the point of view of a client or a user? But if you can actually write it from the point of view of somebody who's going to use that API, so you're always looking at it from the outside, and you can show it to people that might use it, that there's a high likelihood you're going to end up with an API that people will like. Because if people don't like your APIs, they won't use them. Increasingly, that's what we're seeing. And the people who are really successful at creating APIs and making money from them are people that design APIs that developers like to work with and find easy and comfortable to work with, not just in isolation, but in conjunction with other APIs from your offering and other, complementary APIs on the internet for that matter.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've really enjoyed it, actually. And I think, as I said, I looked at it and I sort of thought, would I? Why would I? Why do I need it? And I think you've done a cracking job with it, because I actually want to go out there and have a play with it now.
Well, you can easily. Yeah, you can easily. I mean, you 15-day trial, and if you decide you like it, James, you'll notice I'll pass you the promo code.
Sure.
For this podcast, which will give you and anybody else who wants to use it 20% off the product if you want to buy it for a year. But you're going to get 15 days, not 15 years.
You heard it here first. You're going to get 15 years free.
15 years free, 15-day free trial, and you can extend that on. If you run out of time, you can just get back to us, fill in a form, and you get an extension.
Sure, because we all know what happens. The developers get hold of it, they build the stuff, and they go, "It's great," and then QA and UAT and the business don't look at it for another 3 months, and we can't test it because the trial's expired, and you can't see it. There you go.
That's it. So we get plenty of that, and we get people with good intentions downloading it and then get kind of put, they get off, they go on something else. So yeah, there's some latitude and flexibility. So do you think, is there anything else that's left on the list, James?
No, I think that's it. I think you've covered off pretty much everything. I'm out of questions, really. So okay. Definitely thanks for coming on, and thanks for talking about Represen API Studio. This was the second attempt at recording this, because last time the world of software production got in the way and deadlines, and it stopped us from doing it. But I'm really, really happy that we managed to reschedule this and get it done. It's been really good, really, really worthwhile.
Okay, well, I'm really glad to hear you say that, James, and thanks very much for for hooking up with us so that we could do this. And much good may it do everyone. Yeah,
well, thank you very much. And thanks to you guys out there for listening. This is The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Miles Daffin talking about Represen API Studio. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform and help The Cynical Developer to grow by increasing its audience. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links and show notes for each episode.